When the last cannons on the European battlefields fell silent, the United States, across the ocean, had become the nation holding more German prisoners of war than any other Allied country. Few would have imagined that among the cotton fields of Texas or the deserts of Arizona once stood barbed wire compounds where hundreds of thousands of Germans, men who had once worn Hitler's SS uniform, lived in exile in the heart of America. They were not only Wehrmacht soldiers, tank crews, pilots, and sailors, but also a small, little-known group. German women, nurses, medical staff, military clerks, and even civilians swept up by the storm of war. Most German POWs captured in North Africa, Italy, and France were first taken to Britain, then shipped across the Atlantic to ports such as Halifax, New York, or Boston. From there, they continued by train through landscapes they had known only from maps: the southern plains, the forests of Alabama, the endless prairies of Texas. For them, America was not a promised land, but a place of exile amid their enemies. Locked inside sealed train cars, none knew their destination, only the grinding of metal on rails and the acrid smell of coal mixed with fear. According to the U.S. War Department, between 1942 and 1946, more than 425,000 German POWs were brought to the United States, distributed among over 500 camps across 46 states. A very small fraction of them were women, mostly military nurses, medical aides, or civilians who had worked in Army supply units when captured. Since the U.S. had never planned to receive female German POWs, they were placed in separate compounds often near Army hospitals or medical zones, both for safety and to make use of their medical expertise, a valuable resource at a time when tens of thousands of prisoners suffered wounds, malaria, or malnutrition after brutal European campaigns. One of the most notable camps was Camp Florence, deep in the Arizona desert. Initially built for Italian soldiers, it became a mixed camp after 1944, housing both German POWs and a small number of female captives, mostly medical staff taken with ambulance convoys. What astonished many Germans was not the barbed wire or armed guards, but the order and discipline of the American camp system. There was no torture, no beatings, no thirst or starvation, as they had heard about camps in Eastern Europe. Each prisoner had a bed, meals that met U.S. Army nutritional standards, and even access to clean clothes, books, and musical instruments. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, the U.S. was obliged to treat prisoners humanely, and Washington not only complied but exceeded those standards. The camps had their own hospitals, sports fields, libraries, and even stages where prisoners could perform. For women who had lived through the bombings of Berlin or tended to mangled soldiers in field hospitals, the calm of an American POW camp felt surreal. A dream without sirens or smoke, but also without freedom. In her memoir, Helene Schaefer, a German nurse captured in Italy and sent to Camp Atterbury in Indiana, recalled, "We stepped off the train and looked fearfully at the American soldiers. They carried guns, yet their eyes held no hatred. An officer who spoke perfect German told us we would be given care, medicine, and rest. I couldn't believe it. Everything was so different from what the Nazis had told us about Americans." For many German women, it was their first glimpse of a democratic and scientific medical system: spacious wards, sterilized instruments, male and female doctors working side by side, sometimes even black physicians, something Nazi Germany would never have allowed. Some female POWs who were doctors or nurses were invited by the U.S. Army to continue medical work, not as forced labor, but as professional collaboration. They treated wounded prisoners, helped with childbirth for female inmates, and assisted U.S. medical officers in vaccinations and disease prevention. Records from the Army Medical Department list hundreds of births, surgeries, and treatments performed through cooperation between American and German doctors. Many former prisoners later wrote letters of gratitude to the U.S. Army, thanking them for being treated as human beings, not enemies. For the American public, however, images of well-treated German prisoners sparked controversy. Some who had lost husbands or sons in the war believed the enemy deserves no kindness. Yet President Roosevelt's government insisted that strict adherence to the Geneva Convention was a moral message of American democracy, that even in war, the U.S. distinguished between fighting and vengeance. Humane treatment of German POWs also helped safeguard captured American soldiers in Europe as Germany was compelled to reciprocate. Among the most notable female prisoners was Dr. Lieselotte Meyer, an obstetrician from Hamburg captured in Italy in 1944 while treating the wounded in a field hospital. She was sent first to Camp Shanks, New York, and later to a POW hospital in Texas, where she helped deliver babies for Italian and German women. She wrote in her diary, "The Americans did not ask whom I had served. They only asked whom I could save. When I stepped into the delivery room, I was no longer a prisoner. I was a doctor." Those words would later be cited in studies on medical ethics in wartime, a testament to how even the cruelty of war could not extinguish compassion. Alongside the medical staff were civilians mistakenly captured in France or Italy, secretaries, logistics workers, and even officers' wives and children trapped in combat zones. They were detained for identification before repatriation, some assigned to kitchen, laundry, or clerical work within the camps, earning token pay and POW labor coupons exchangeable for cigarettes, soap, or postcards. In letters sent home through the Red Cross, many wrote that Americans are not the devils we were told they were, that they feed us, heal us, and do not call us by numbers. Yet life in the camps was far from idyllic. Homesickness, uncertainty about loved ones, and the strain of captivity led many women into depression. To maintain morale, the camps organized classes, sports, and music. American volunteers sometimes taught English or shared books. Friendships bloomed across barbed wire, and sometimes even quiet romances, forbidden by military law, yet preserved in diaries, glances, and memories. Remarkably, unlike many other places in the world, no cases of abuse against female German POWs were recorded in the United States. Declassified military archives confirm that America maintained one of the most humane prisoner systems of the war. That reality reshaped the memories of many returning Germans who no longer saw the American enemy as an occupier, but as people who respected law, and even the defeated. When the war ended in 1945, the repatriation of German POWs stretched over 3 years. While waiting to return to Europe, many women continued medical work in camp hospitals, caring for the sick and learning new techniques. Some sought to remain in the U.S., marrying Americans or receiving sponsorship because of their medical skills. Those who returned to Germany carried a deep memory within them that in the land once considered their enemy, they had found humanity and mercy that war had seemed to destroy. From the ships departing New York in 1946, thousands of women looked back at the American coastline for the last time. In them, the pain of defeat mingled with quiet gratitude. They had arrived in fear of cruelty, but departed with a new understanding that even an enemy can be one's savior, and that compassion may prove stronger than victory. Amid the arid expanse of the Arizona desert, where the sun beat down in waves of blistering heat, the infirmary at Camp Florence pulsed with the steady rhythm of work. The soft tapping of boots on concrete, the clink of syringes against metal trays, the mixed cadence of English and German as American doctors and German prisoners exchanged words in two tangled tongues. There, medicine became the only language still intelligible between former enemies. When the first waves of German POWs arrived in the United States, American military hospitals were unprepared for such a massive influx of patients. Thousands came in malnourished, wounded, suffering from infectious diseases or psychological trauma. The U.S. Army quickly realized it needed more medical personnel than ever before, and within the ranks of the prisoners were doctors, nurses, and pharmacists trained in Europe's finest institutions. Rather than let them waste away behind barbed wire, the Army Medical Corps decided to employ them within the POW medical system, under American supervision. This policy, approved by the War Department in 1943, became one of the rare examples of wartime medical cooperation between opposing sides. At Camp Florence, the chief medical officer was Major Robert H. Callahan, a veteran of the North African Campaign. He believed that caring for prisoners was not merely a duty, but a test of civilization's conscience. Callahan allowed German doctors, after passing security checks, to work in the infirmary, treating both prisoners and lightly wounded American soldiers. They wore white coats without insignia and were addressed not by number but by title: Dr. Meyer, Nurse Ingrid, Medic Carl. In Callahan's handwritten notes appeared one simple line: "They were once the enemy, but in this hospital everyone fights on the same side, the side of life. At first, suspicion hung heavy. Some American soldiers refused to let German doctors touch them. But when an appendectomy performed by a German POW saved the life of an Italian prisoner, and when Dr. Lieselot Meyer successfully delivered a difficult birth alongside an American nurse, attitudes began to change. "We realized that beneath those white coats everyone was simply human," Callahan wrote. Medical reports show that between 1944 and 1946, nearly all major POW camps in the U.S. had their own hospitals, equipped like civilian facilities, with operating rooms, X-ray units, pharmacies, and mixed staffs of Americans and POWs. At Camp Shanks and Camp Atterbury, German physicians were even permitted to conduct research and compile medical manuals to maintain professional standards, a rare occurrence in wartime history. That cooperation was more than technical. It was a meeting of two moral worlds. German doctors, educated under nationalist ideology that viewed medicine as a tool to serve the strength of the nation, now witnessed a radically different ethos. In America, patients, even prisoners, were addressed by name, consulted before treatment, and granted privacy. This left many German physicians stunned. One POW remarked, "In Germany, we were taught to serve the fatherland. Here, they teach me to serve humanity." One example recorded by the Red Cross Medical Commission in 1945 tells of a German POW named Helmut Kruger who lost his right arm to shrapnel. Instead of dismissing it as an inevitable wartime injury, an American doctor arranged for him to receive a prosthetic limb, though costly and not required by any rule. When Kruger broke down in tears, an American officer simply said, "He's a man, not a corpse." That small act became, for many prisoners, their first glimpse of true human dignity, something beyond nationality. In the camp hospitals, German nurses played a vital role. They bridged two languages, two medical systems, and two moral worlds. Many had seen Nazi hospitals where human experimentation was sanctioned. When they observed American doctors following strict ethical standards, from sterilization procedures to informed consent, they began to grasp the true meaning of the Hippocratic Oath. A nurse named Ingrid Müller wrote in her 1952 memoir, published in Hamburg, "When I asked Dr. Callahan why he gave precious antibiotics to a prisoner instead of an American soldier, he only smiled and said, 'Because he needs it more.'" I had never heard such words in all my years in Germany. Moments like that, one pill, one operation, one nod of respect, gradually blurred the line between victor and vanquished. Outside the camp, many Americans were uneasy about feeding the enemy. But religious organizations, especially the Red Cross and Protestant churches, organized visits, donated books, sent gifts, and taught English. For them, it was a moral duty, to prove that freedom and humanity were not slogans but actions. These visits often moved the German women to tears. For the first time, they were treated kindly by the enemy of their nation. One American medical officer put it simply, "If we treat them cruelly, we only breed more hatred. But if we save their lives, we plant the seeds of another world." And indeed, after the war, those seeds sprouted. Many German POW doctors returned to their ruined homeland, carrying the lessons and ethics they had learned in American camps. They became among the first in post-war West Germany to denounce inhumane medical experiments, contributing to the drafting of the Nuremberg Code in 1947, the foundation of modern medical ethics. Principles such as the voluntary consent of the subject, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, and protection of human life all trace their roots to the memories of those who had practiced medicine in U.S. POW hospitals. The spirit of compassion endured beyond theory. Several German nurses later sent letters of gratitude to their American colleagues, enclosing photos of the Florence or Atterbury infirmaries. In one 1947 letter, Ingrid Müller wrote, "I came to America as a prisoner, but left as a student of humanity. I learned that medicine has no borders, only patience." It is astonishing that in the brutal context of World War II, in a nation fighting on two fronts, the United States devoted resources to the health of its enemies. Yet that choice reflected a profound philosophy embedded in America's POW policy. We treat the enemy humanely not because they deserve it, but because we wish to preserve our own dignity. That principle, recorded in the Manual of Military Government, 1944, would later shape international law. Years later, as the POW camps were dismantled and their hospitals vanished into the sand, only stone foundations remained. But in the memories of those who passed through them, Camp Florence was not merely a place of captivity, it was where humanity was rediscovered amid the fires of war. In a 1970 interview, retired Dr. Callahan was asked what he remembered most. He answered simply, "I remember the hands of German prisoners, the hands of American nurses, our hands clasped after saving a life. We no longer knew who was who." Amid the blood-soaked pages of 20th century history, filled with bombs, bodies, and victories, there still runs a quiet line, often overlooked. The story of people who chose to heal instead of harm, to save instead of hate. At Camp Florence, where the bugle once sounded roll call and the barbed wire has long rusted away, archaeologists still find syringe casings, shards of surgical glass, and a scrap of paper faintly inked in German. Für das Leben. For life. Just 4 words, but they hold the full meaning of that moment in history, the time when enemies taught each other how to be human again. When the summer of 1945 descended upon the Arizona desert, the heat seemed to scorch the very sky. Inside the hospital compound of Camp Florence, ceiling fans creaked and the smell of antiseptic mingled with dry sand. There, men and women who had once been enemies now worked side by side in a strange space, a place where human conscience rose above the front lines. After months of testing and supervision, the U.S. Army Medical Corps found that German doctors and nurses were not only disciplined, but highly skilled, particularly in battlefield surgery, trauma treatment, and epidemic control. By mid-1944, the War Department authorized the Medical Collaboration Program, an initiative to make use of German POWs' medical expertise within the American prisoner care and military medical system. It was one of the most ethically and practically groundbreaking decisions of the Second World War, turning former adversaries into colleagues. At first, the program met fierce opposition. Many Americans who had lost loved ones in the war argued that Nazi doctors could never be trusted. But senior medical officers, including Major General Norman T. Kirk, Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, maintained that medicine belonged to no politics and that a healing hand is never the enemy. That conviction gradually prevailed. Hundreds of German POW physicians were allowed to work under supervision in the camps, and a few were even invited to assist in nearby military hospitals, especially in cases involving European prisoners. At Camp Florence, Dr. Robert Callahan expanded the hospital into 3 sections: internal medicine, surgery, and maternal child care. The German staff took charge of part of the internal and surgical wards, while the Americans managed quarantine and nursing. Between them, the initial lines began to fade. One morning, as the sun rose over the Santa Rita Mountains, Dr. Ingrid Mueller, a German prisoner, stepped into the operating room beside Dr. Mary Caldwell, an American Army surgeon. Before them lay an Italian POW with shrapnel lodged in his lung. They looked at each other. No words, only the silent understanding that the life before them carried no flag. In the chilled air came the sound of scalpels, the hum of the suction pump, 2 hands, one of the enemy and one of the victor, holding on to a fragile pulse of life. After the surgery, Caldwell wrote in her report, "Had she not been there, the patient would not have survived. We spoke 2 languages, but our hands understood each other." From such operations, a thread of professional and human connection was woven. The American doctors were impressed by the Germans' mastery of bleeding control, suturing, and rapid diagnosis. The German prisoners, in turn, learned from the Americans about systematic work, patient respect, and the efficient use of medicine. They exchanged techniques, kept notes in both languages, and even held bilingual medical discussions each week, something unheard of between 2 warring sides. One American nurse later recalled, "It was the strangest classroom in the world. There were guards outside, but inside people spoke only of pulse, heart, and lungs. No uniforms, no ranks, just the scratch of pens and the thin haze of cigarette smoke." A German doctor wrote in his diary, In war, we were told to hate. But here, I was allowed to place my hand on an American's chest and listen to his heartbeat. That was when I knew I was still human. The cooperation soon expanded beyond treatment to epidemic prevention and sanitation. When typhoid and influenza outbreaks swept through the camps, the joint U.S.-German medical teams launched disinfection drives, vaccination campaigns, and water supply improvements. As a result, the POW death rate in the U.S. camps remained only 0.06%, the lowest among all Allied detention systems, a figure that astonished European medical authorities after the war. Meanwhile, in American field hospitals across Europe, doctors and nurses began treating wounded German prisoners, and the lessons from Camp Florence became a moral standard for POW care. No discrimination, no retribution, only healing. Those principles were later cited in the United Nations Health Commission Report, 1947, as a model of humanitarian conduct in armed conflict. For the female German POWs working in the camp, the collaboration carried an even deeper meaning. They were exposed to the modern American system of medical training, learning to record case histories, sterilize instruments, and use antibiotics, which were still rare in Germany. Ingrid Müller never forgot the first time she saw penicillin, the miracle drug Dr. Callahan called science's gift to humanity. I cried when I saw a patient with severe infection recover in just 3 days. In Germany, we had none of this. I realized that if not for the war, I might never have learned such things. From these experiences, many POW physicians began compiling notes into what became known as the Florence Report, a collection of medical studies written inside the camp. Though never officially published, the manuscript was later preserved in the U.S. Army Medical Library, and excerpts were cited by the Hamburg Medical Institute in 1950. One line read, "Collaboration under the conditions of war proved that medical knowledge cannot be confined by borders or ideology." Beyond the fences, public opinion also began to shift. When news spread that a German doctor had saved the life of an American child from severe poisoning near the camp, volunteering his help, the local press ran the headline, "Prisoner saves our son." From then on, the image of the German POWs was no longer entirely dark. Some American doctors even wrote letters of recommendation so that a few German physicians could remain in the U.S. on humanitarian grounds. Several did stay, later becoming American citizens, teaching medicine and helping build international medical partnerships. The cooperation between the two sides did more than save lives. It saved the souls of those involved. Many German prisoners admitted that within the camp hospital, they glimpsed for the first time a society driven by reason and trust, not fear. They learned that true science does not serve hatred, it serves life. At a year-end seminar in 1945, Dr. Callahan stood before a crowded ward and said to his mixed audience of Americans and Germans, "We may lose or we may win, but if we keep our humanity, we are all victors." That sentence was later engraved on a small memorial stone at the former site of the Camp Florence Hospital amid the red sands of Arizona. The simple inscription reads, "Where enemies healed together. Noin hung kathu kung chua lan." After the war ended, the medical collaboration program was dissolved, and the prisoners were gradually repatriated. Yet many Americans remembered them as true colleagues. Dr. Caldwell recalled that on the day Ingrid Müller left the camp, she left behind her surgical glove and a small note. "Do not forget that this hand once belonged to an enemy, but it helped you save a life." At international medical conferences in the early 1950s, when nations debated ethical codes for scientific research, many delegates cited the American example, a place where even in wartime, enemies could share the same operating table. More than half a century later, in 1995, a group of military medical historians visited the old Camp Florence site. Amid wind and sand, they found shards of glass, syringe casings, and a weathered leather notebook. On one of its pages, written in 2 languages, was a single line, "Medicine is the last bridge when all others have fallen." The line was unsigned, but perhaps it needed no name. For in that place where those who once fired upon each other had joined hands to save lives, names no longer mattered. Only one truth remained, that humanity itself is the strongest medicine ever discovered. When the last guns in Europe fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. But across the ocean, behind the barbed wire of America's POW camps, another kind of battle was quietly unfolding. A battle within the minds of those who had once worn the swastika on their sleeves. War had taught them how to hate. Now America would teach them how to be human. At first, most German prisoners, men and women alike, clung to a cold pride. They believed their defeat was only temporary, that the Third Reich still represented the peak of civilization. In the barracks, they hummed Die Fahne hoch, still greeting each other with Heil Hitler when guards turned away. But as the days passed, they realized that the world beyond the wire was nothing like what propaganda had told them. In America, they saw women driving trucks, running factories, and teaching in schools. They saw black and white workers laboring side by side. They saw citizens criticizing their government openly in newspapers without fear of arrest. For those raised under totalitarian indoctrination, it was a shock. A German nurse named Greta Hoffmann wrote in her diary, "I don't understand how a country that allows women so much freedom can fight so well. Here, they don't shout slogans, they just work, and they work efficiently." Change began with such small realizations. As prisoners were allowed to read American newspapers, watch films, and listen to the radio, they gradually discovered that truth did not always match what Berlin had taught them. Many read for the first time about concentration camps, Auschwitz, the millions of Jews murdered. At first, they refused to believe it. "That's just the victor's propaganda," they said. But photographs, testimonies, and stories from fellow prisoners who had returned from Europe slowly broke through the wall of denial. Inside the camps, the U.S. Army skillfully organized democracy discussion sessions, part of the re-education program. German officers watched documentaries on liberalism, listened to lectures on the U.S. Constitution, and discussed wartime ethics. There was no coercion, no slogans, only an invitation to think. Dr. Ingrid Müller, who worked in the camp hospital, later recalled, "I was invited to a film screening about the U.S. Constitution. When I saw people protesting their government in the streets without being arrested, I realized perhaps our enemy was never truly evil." At the same time, American perceptions were changing too. At first, soldiers were told, "Don't trust the Germans." But after months of guard duty, many discovered that their enemies were not monsters, just human beings who missed home, sang songs, and wept. Private Lewis Carter, a 22-year-old guard, wrote to his mother, "Mom, I think they're just like us. They did what they were taught to do. There's a German girl named Ingrid who stayed up all night caring for an Italian prisoner. I don't think God takes sides in that." Gradually, cultural exchanges blossomed. Concerts, plays, literature clubs, even English-German language classes. German POWs taught American soldiers folk songs. Americans taught them to dance swing. In those moments, enemies became people. One prisoner joked half-seriously, "If the war had lasted longer, we'd have turned into Americans by now." Yet the transformation was not easy. Some Germans remained deeply indoctrinated, hostile to anything American. The camp authorities understood this, dividing prisoners into 3 groups: pro-Nazi, neutral, and anti-Nazi. Those in the last group were made block leaders, translators, or teaching assistants. Through them, the spirit of democracy grew from within, rather than being imposed from outside. One of the most remarkable changes came among German officers. Many, educated and thoughtful, began to see that American society functioned not through fear, but through self-discipline. When a U.S. soldier stopped his truck just to help a local child, Major Karl Brenner remarked, "In Germany, we were taught that discipline chains society together. Here they prove that freedom is the real bond. Such simple moments slowly melted arrogance. Prisoners began writing thank you letters, sending small gifts to guards' families, or asking to learn carpentry, mechanics, and farming. They understood that when they returned to their devastated homeland, the skills learned in America, teamwork, organization, respect for rules, would be their tools to rebuild life. Some camps even held open days, inviting local residents to exhibitions made by the POWs, paintings, crafts, technical models. Newspapers wrote, "No one fears these Germans anymore." Once seen as dangerous enemies, they became living proof of the power of humanity. Across the ocean, in a shattered Germany where hunger and bitterness remained, the returning prisoners brought something different, a spark of democracy. When asked about their years in captivity, they did not speak of hunger or punishment, but of libraries, classrooms, music, and guards who smiled. One former POW said in a 1948 interview, "We were taught how to kill, but in America, they taught us how to live." That generation would help form the moral foundation of post-war democratic Germany. They understood tolerance, and that real strength lies not in weapons, but in forgiveness. Historians later called it the POW camp effect, the process that transformed those once devoted to hate into believers in freedom and human rights. Interestingly, the process also left deep marks on the American psyche. Many veterans and locals later recalled that living alongside German prisoners had softened their prejudices and anger. A woman in Texas remembered that she once feared, "The Germans would kill my child." But when she saw them planting vegetables, crafting toys, and singing at Christmas, she realized that war was only a shell. Beneath it, people were all the same. In a letter sent to Ingrid Müller after she returned home, Dr. Mary Caldwell wrote, "I learned from you that even an enemy can teach us good things. Perhaps that is the hardest lesson war has to offer." That simple line captured the spirit of an entire era. That war not only divides people, but sometimes, through hardship, allows them to truly see one another. When the POW camps were finally dismantled, fences torn down, guard towers removed, and barracks demolished, one barrier remained, the one inside people's hearts, and it, too, had begun to fall. Across the Arizona desert, cotton fields now grew over the old campgrounds. Beneath that soil lay the traces of men and women who had once faced each other in battle, but had learned together how to make peace. A journalist once wrote, "In a place meant for hatred, they planted the seeds of understanding, and when those seeds took root, they yielded something neither side had expected: humanity." When the war ended, the world was buried in ashes. Across Europe, once bustling cities were reduced to blackened frames, streets littered with rubble, and weary figures searching for lost loved ones. But across the ocean, on American soil, among the corrugated barracks of the POW camps, a final chapter quietly began, the chapter of return and of human memory. From mid-1945 to 1946, the United States began repatriating German prisoners of war in coordination with Britain and France. Hundreds of thousands were brought to ports such as New York, Boston, and New Orleans, then shipped across the Atlantic back to Europe. They were not shackled nor driven away. Each received a new set of clothes, a small sum saved from their camp wages, and a certificate that read, "Has complied with the provisions of the Geneva Convention." To many Americans, the farewells were bittersweet. Villagers in Texas, Louisiana, and Nebraska went to the stations to see off the men they had once called enemies. Many shook hands, offered cakes, and exchanged letters. Some prisoners wept. At Camp Ruston, the POW band played Auld Lang Syne at the farewell ceremony, the old tune of friendship drifting across the sunset, leaving guards and prisoners alike silent and moved. One former prisoner recalled, "None of us expected to cry when leaving the camp, but we did, because we knew that, for the first time in our lives, we had been treated as human beings." When they set foot back in Germany, they found that their homeland was no longer home. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered, hunger and cold reigned. Amid that desolation, those who had returned from America carried with them something more precious than any material possession: a new understanding of humanity and democracy. Many said that in America, they learned what it meant to have self-respect without fear. They had seen a society with order but without secret police, with discipline but without whips. Those experiences became seeds in their minds, seeds that grew into the belief that Germany could be reborn through the spirit of freedom. Not a few went on to become teachers, engineers, doctors, or journalists, contributing to the democratization of the Federal Republic of Germany. Many who had participated in the American re-education program later helped spread ideas of civil rights, self-governance, and respect for human dignity among post-war youth organizations. They became the seedlings of a new Germany, one that valued professional ethics and humanity above military honor. In the field of medicine, the impact was especially profound. Doctors and nurses who had been allowed to practice within POW camps returned with a changed view of their profession. They had once served the machinery of war, but after witnessing their American counterparts treat both prisoners and soldiers alike, they understood that medicine knows no national or ideological boundaries. Some became leading voices at international medical ethics conferences, condemning inhumane Nazi experiments and advocating for the 1947 Nuremberg Code, the cornerstone of modern medical ethics. Yet the legacy of those camps lived not only in books or resolutions, but in simple human stories. In 1953, a small Texas town received a letter from Hamburg, Germany. Inside was a photo of a young boy and a trembling note. "This is my son. I named him Louis, after the guard who shared his bread with me that winter." In another story from Nebraska, a former prisoner returned years later to the farm where he had once worked. The old farmer came out, said nothing, opened the door to the barn where the man had slept, and embraced him. There were no victors or vanquished left, only two men who had once shared an improbable moment in history. Historians later called it the humanitarian effect, a rare phenomenon in war when the victors chose not revenge, but compassion to transform the defeated. That effect spread through tens of thousands of personal stories, through letters, photos, and hurried notes of gratitude. Historian Arnold Kramer, who devoted his life to studying German POWs in America, concluded, "If there was ever a place in the world where humanity triumphed over hatred, it was in the German prisoner of war camps of the United States." For Americans, too, the legacy endured. The young guards who once watched over the camps became doctors, teachers, and community leaders. They told their children that even in war, there is room for kindness. Some former camps were preserved as museums or memorial parks, like Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Algona in Iowa, and Camp Clinton in Mississippi. There, visitors can see paintings, sculptures, and diaries left by German prisoners, testament to human creativity and resilience even in captivity. By the 1980s, as U.S.-German relations deepened, many former POWs returned to visit their old camps. They brought their children and grandchildren, standing before cracked concrete foundations and telling stories of their youth. One said, "We came here as prisoners, but we left as men who had learned what freedom means." Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of humanity, not buildings or documents, but the quiet transformation of the human heart. For war can teach people to hate, but only compassion can teach them to understand one another. When the barbed wire rusted away, the watchtowers collapsed, and time covered everything in dust, some memories still remained. Memories of outstretched hands and warm eyes between those who once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield. In a century of bombs and cruelty, these were the rare moments that proved humankind could rise above itself. One American writer, after interviewing former prisoners, wrote a line that would be quoted for decades. At Camp Florence, Camp Clinton, and hundreds of others, Americans did not merely imprison their enemies, they imprisoned hatred itself. And when the gates opened, only human beings walked out, not soldiers. Today, when we look back on World War II, through pages filled with smoke and atrocity, the story of the German POW camps in America still shines like a small but warm light, the light of humanity in an inhuman time. It reminds us that the true strength of a nation lies not only in its weapons, but in how it treats its enemies. And perhaps that is why those who once walked out of those camps, though their hair has turned gray and their memories have dimmed, can still tell their children and grandchildren in a gentle voice, "I have seen war, but I have also seen kindness, and it was that kindness that saved us both."